This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. A free market does not deliver perfect outcomes. It's easy to see problems in the world and say, the government should do something. But often when the government does something, there are other unintended secondary consequences that create further problems. In fact, a lot of the problems we see in the world aren't a failure of the free market at all. They're the unintended consequences of previous government interventions into the market. That's the theme we're going to explore in today's show. My first guest is Dr. Bradley Hobbs. Dr. Hobbs is a clinical professor of economics at Clemson University. He's also the co-author of the new book, The Justice of Capitalism. Brad, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So, I know the 19th century French economist Frédéric Bastiat was kind of an inspiration for your new book. Why? What about him?
I think Bastiat was probably one of the wittiest and most humorous writers of economics, and he also put things into stories, and the stories help people to understand without all of the fancy things that economists can do. So it's something that relates to everyone, I think, and you can follow Bastiat very easily.
So let's play a little game of some Bastiat, of his classic examples, and then how you could relate it to unintended consequences in the modern world. So classic story is French village. They see a broken window, and everybody's bemoaning the fact that there's a window that's broken. And then the economist pipes up and says, oh, but the good news is this is going to require the homeowner to hire the glazier to come in and replace the window. And he's going to get paid, let's say, $20 for that. But then he's going to go to the bakery and buy some bread and other products, and the baker makes $20, and the baker's going to go out to dinner somewhere. And eventually, as the story keeps going, this $20 has gone around the whole community, and everybody's richer. So the economist says this is really good news that we have a broken window.
Well, it sounds like a little bit of Keynesian economics there, doesn't it? There's a multiplier ostensibly, but Bastiat makes the note that if you have a situation where there's destruction and there is some sort of let's say a broken window, indeed the baker would have to pay the glazier, and that money would go to the glazier. But think about the fact that the baker probably would have rather bought something else than the repair of a broken window. And so it's not as if that money would not have been used for many other things that the baker would like to have. So there's a line in that story, actually, destruction is not profitable. And it doesn't matter where it is. And if it were profitable, then we should simply issue everybody ball-peen hammers and tell them to go around breaking windows.
But of course, if we did that, would be a lot poorer for all of the broken windows.
Everyone would be poor. The goal of economic activity is to be more productive. It is not activity of and in and for itself. It's to be actually productive to achieve the things that we want to achieve.
So for Bastiat then in this story, the unseen is what?
Well, the unseen is that whatever you spent could have been spent on something else. That thing will never be seen because you had to spend it to fix the window. So I lived in South Florida for many years. I'm a native Floridian, and we had hurricanes, and I had pretty significant damage to a house on the order of about $60,000. I did have insurance, but I ended up paying quite a bit out of pocket also to fix the house. I would rather not have had that. Yet if you hear the news and watch the news and think about what people say, oh, this is a great boom for the construction industry. Well, yes, for the construction industry, it's a payment, but I would have rather spent that money on other things.
Right, and your community was poorer as a result of the hurricane, even though economic activity might have gone up. It was just to replace what you already had.
Absolutely. What we want is productive economic activity, and that's really what Bastiat is drawing a distinction between, is sort of activity for the sake of activity as opposed to activity that actually achieves some goals that we want to achieve.
That's kind of a common theme in his stories, because he's got another classic one about protecting the candle making industry. In the context of 19th century France, electricity is coming along and jobs are being destroyed in the candle industry, right?
Absolutely. And if we think about dynamic change, I think that's one of the big differences between people who, to me, really understand economics and those who sort of understand economics, and that is understanding how dynamic things are, and these changes will come and come and come. In the case of the candle makers, he basically argues that we should block the sun. and block the sun to provide jobs for everyone who's involved in providing lighting in a home. One of the nice things about Bastiat is you can get these stories out of him, and I believe the candlemaker story is 2 or 3 pages. It's really quite short, but it is absolutely witty, and I laugh out loud. I guffaw at times as I read Bastiat, and he tells such a great story about this. And again, we could tie this today to tariffs.
So let's finish off with the candle. So his satire on this is they petition the French government to block out the sun for the benefit of the candle makers. Explain why this is wrong. It's protecting jobs, right?
Well, it is protecting jobs, but very specific jobs. And those jobs would be those who make lighting. So he suggests that we cover everything, every hole, chink, and fissure in the house that allows the natural sun in, the natural light of the sun in. And that way the sun would be blocked. There would be darkness in the house. And then, of course, you would have plenty of jobs for people who made lights and tapers and candles and kerosene lanterns and so on and so forth to light the house, despite the fact that the sun was there for free.
And we are all poor as a result of not having free sunlight.
And we are all poor. And we also do damage, I think, and this is a little bit beyond Bastiat, but we do damage in not accepting the change. It's harder to accept change as you get older, particularly, I think. But change is the only real, to use a well-worn phrase, change is the only constant. And in economics, the more change you have, the better things are. This is like what Schumpeter called creative destruction. So it's destructive, but it only is destroyed through creation. So my 8-track tape player of high school gave way to cassettes, gave way to CDs. And I can remember my students, at one point, I told them that when they put their iPod in the drawer and said, what a piece of junk this is, to remember me, and they all laughed. But they quit making the iPod 3 years ago.
So bring this up to date now currently. It's not candle makers and stuff, but this seems to have strong parallels when we see with the current administration in Washington, D.C. talking about trade with China.
Absolutely. Any sort of tariff or blocking of the natural flow of trade, it doesn't matter whether it's international or domestic, is stopping this change. It is slowing down this dynamic change and creative destruction that occurs. Imagine that we had decided that we would save CDs or save DVDs. To DVD people who worked in those industries, they would probably be very happy, but it's very unlikely that that could sustain itself, number one. And number two, it's certainly not the most efficient way to get movies.
How about this? How about if somebody says, China is trading with us unfairly, they're subsidizing their exports. Let's say they did it so good that they were like the sun and they gave us Chinese exports for free.
I would say we'd found a sugar daddy. Let China give us anything they want to for free. They could do that for some period of time. They could try to make inroads in particular industries, but they can't sustain that. You can't give away things forever.
But even if they could, if they were like the sun, wouldn't that be great?
It would be great. Absolutely, it would be great. And if other countries want to subsidize our consumption of goods and services, I simply hope that we can find more of them.
So last one more Bastiat, classic example, then let's update it to modern times. He has something he calls the negative railroad.
Yes. And the negative railroad is a story in which there's a line between two towns, and he, legislator of the French Congress, asked to put a break in the line in Bordeaux. And the break in the line was designed so that they could offload the material, then load it back on. Also, maybe people could spend the night and the hotels would have more business and the eating establishments would have more business, and I suspect even the pubs would have more business. And the argument was that this would create jobs in Bordeaux, so we should have a break in the line at Bordeaux. And in about a paragraph or two, Bastiat completely destroys this argument. He says, look, if this makes sense, then we should have a stop at every town along the entire railway, and we will make jobs all the way along the way. And he points out that that's really not the purpose of the railroad.
Right. And so modern corollary would be?
Well, to make jobs in anything, make jobs for the solar industry. Okay, we could take the solar industry, we can subsidize it, we can make jobs, we can sort of push resources in that way. But once you take away the subsidy, those jobs have disappeared and gone away. So the market is saying we're not ready. That's not to say the market won't one day be there. But right now, no.
That the point is not the jobs, it's the service the job provides then.
Well,
and in the negative railroad, they're not providing any service. It's just making work.
No, they're just making work. So it's like the old story about digging ditches and refilling the ditches. It just doesn't make any sense. Again, it's not moving you forward in a productive way. And what we want in an economic system is to be as productive as we can be.
So moving forward more generally to a lesson that you work on in your book is that there's always these secondary unintended consequences, some of which Bastiat is so good at pointing out. Why is it the case that anytime the government intervenes in the marketplace, there's always secondary and unintended consequences?
Well, because they're not omniscient and they can't tell the future, and none of us can. So when we make decisions, we think about risk, but all decisions, the actions of any decision occur in the future. And it's very hard for us to know how other people will respond and how the market will respond and how the world itself will respond to these sorts of changes. Again, I was in South Florida. They brought in a plant called the Melaleuca. The Melaleuca was very good at drying land up, but it turns out it's also extremely invasive and it grows extremely thick, and you nearly cannot get rid of it. When you burn it, the seeds go into hibernation and they come back in 5 or 6 years. So we often try to fix something and we apply some sort of fix to or a law to some issue and create other issues. And if that were not true, then why has law expanded into what really is not law anymore, but is legislation?
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Brad. Stick around in just a minute. We'll be right back and talking about some more of the modern interventions in our economy and their unintended consequences.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeVitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation.
Founded in 2013, the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University promotes the teaching and study of free market economics. As part of our programming, we sponsor a public lecture series open to students, faculty, staff, and the general public in the Lubbock community. Often, the speakers in that series are the guests that you see right here on Free to Exchange. More information is available at www.fmi.ttu.edu or by email at free.market@ttu.edu. Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Nikolai Wenzel. Dr. Wenzel is a professor of economics and the L.V. Hackley Chair for the Study of Capitalism and Free Enterprise at Fayetteville State University. He's also the other author of Justice of Capitalism. Nikolai, welcome to the show.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here.
So your co-author in the first half was talking a little bit about some unintended consequences, but in the process, he started talking about kind of the dynamic evolutionary process of markets and what happens when you leave it alone. But what's the long-run consequences of that?
Well, we have a great puzzle. On the one hand, capitalism is the world's greatest anti-poverty program. Before 1800, before capitalism, everybody was poor. And then suddenly, in certain countries, you start seeing some growth, and we've had explosive growth in the 19th and 20th century. And we see still today, the more a country has capitalism and economic freedom, the wealthier people are and the lower the rates of poverty. On the other hand, capitalism is being attacked everywhere because it's misunderstood. And that's really what we're addressing in this book.
So actually, let me just nitpick with you for a second, because I'm sure there's a viewer out there who hears you say that until 1800, everybody was poor, and they're thinking, great civilizations. What about ancient Rome? What about the Egyptians? We see the stuff that's left. Wasn't there wealth before capitalism?
There was some wealth because there was some exchange, but figure this, no Novocaine, no antibiotics. I mean, the court musician to Louis XIV, this is the wealthiest country in the world at the time, 17th century. Jean-Baptiste Lully died of gangrene after stamping a wooden baton onto his foot. No antibiotics, and something that we consider something banal today. But no antibiotics, no Novocaine, no internet, no modern banking, no air travel. And so there was some wealth, obviously, but there was also massive, massive widespread poverty. Now, fortunately, poverty is becoming the exception.
So then why all the attacks on capitalism if it is that successful at reducing poverty? I mean, I hear Pope Francis on TV saying that capitalism is making the world poor and leaving people impoverished.
Well, that's the problem. I think capitalism is misunderstood. And Bastiat had a lot to write about this. There is what is seen and what is not seen. So whenever there's a social problem, whenever there's an economic problem, the reflex is always, let's pass a law and let's do something about it. But unfortunately, what is seen is the law. What is not seen is the exchange that doesn't happen, the growth that doesn't happen, the unintended consequences. That's the problem.
So in your book, then, what do you investigate of these kind of misconceptions of this in the modern world?
So after the theoretical part, the Bastiat part, and how economics explains unintended consequences, we have 8 case studies that explain the justice of capitalism juxtaposed with the injustice of interventionism. So we start by looking at health and education and poverty. Then we turn to immigration and the status of women and minorities. And we close with the environment, financial regulation, and the justice of capitalism to explain in all those cases how capitalism does a much better job of delivering the things that we want.
All right, well, that's a whole bunch of topics. Let's narrow it down and maybe we've already started talking about poverty, so let's stick with that.
Poverty is a great example. So we have seen historically that capitalism helps lift people out of poverty. We see it in cross-country studies today. But if you look at the US today, there's a bunch of measures that are supposedly intended to end poverty, but really are going to end up making things worse. So first example, minimum wage laws, $15 per hour. That sounds wonderful. That's what's seen. But what is not seen is all the workers who are not worth $15 an hour losing their jobs. We see 10% of GDP today in the US is caught up in complying with federal regulations. Depending on the year, it's somewhere between 60,000 and 90,000 pages of federal regulations with which businesses have to comply. They're spending resources on that, allegedly because it's making the world a better place, but instead they're not spending resources on creating new jobs.
So tell me a little bit about, so when we see poverty in the United States, first of all, it's a relative poverty that we have. By global standards, historic standards, poverty in the United States is still relatively well off.
Correct.
But it is a problem. So other than a minimum wage, what are the other regulations or laws out there whose byproduct is to worsen relative poverty in the United States?
Well, one example was a growing problem is job licensing. So in the 1950s, about 5% of occupations required a license from the state. Today, that's up to about 20%. Now, I'll give you a simple example. An EMT paramedic needs about 400 hours of training. And there's an argument that could be made. These are people who are saving our lives, that they need training and they need a license. But to be a hairdresser in the US, the average time is 1,600 hours, plus classes, plus paying for the license. So we see in these cases, allegedly in the name of public safety or the public good, we're trying to help people allegedly, but what we're really doing is making it expensive for people to learn a craft and practice their trade.
So how is it perpetuating poverty then?
Well, it's perpetuating poverty because people who would like to engage in economic activity are not able to do so because it's so expensive. And that's where you ask yourself if it really is an unintended consequence, and that leads to the second part of the book on cronyism. Really what's going on is that those people who are insiders, who are established, are trying to keep outsiders out to keep the competition down so that the insiders can have higher wages. But that means the outsiders have a hard time finding jobs, have a hard time finding good jobs, have a hard time taking risk and becoming entrepreneurs in the American economy.
Yeah, and I think it's really obvious when we see that in occupational licensure. It's often the profession itself who's asking to be regulated.
Yes.
So, but let's broaden this out from poverty then to thinking about capitalism and the injustice of it versus cronyism. I mean, a lot of people look at 2008, the financial crisis. We're just over a decade removed from that now. And they say, well, that is capitalism. That's the failure of capitalism. And that also created poverty and injustice in the world. How do you respond to this?
I think that's a great example because everybody thinks that's a crisis of capitalism. It's not. It's a crisis of interventionism. So if you look especially at the decade leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, you see the Federal Reserve with very low interest rates, artificially pumping money into the economy and creating a bubble. You see federal housing policy, which probably with good intentions was trying to get poor people into housing. And to do that, they were helping the banks out by subsidizing the loans, which created a moral hazard situation, but also punishing banks that weren't making enough loans to people who would traditionally not have qualified. And the sad part of this is that during the 2000s, it worked. A lot of poor people, a lot of people with bad credit were able to get housing. That's wonderful. But they're the very ones who lost their houses afterwards. So that's a typical example of the government coming in, allegedly trying to help people, but in the end, really hurting people.
And who was winning in this?
Well, that's the tricky part. And this is always trying to figure out if these are really unintended consequences from people who don't understand economics or if it was intentional. A lot of the banks won. The real estate developers won. And we see in a lot of the cases, those are also some of the top industries lobbying the federal government for regulation. One example as a follow-up is in 2010, the DoddFrank Act was passed allegedly to re-regulate the financial markets. But one of the effects of the DoddFrank Act was to raise the cost of regulation, which is wonderful if you're a big bank and you can afford it through economies of scale. But if you're a small bank, it's going to be very hard to comply. And we've seen massive reconcentration in the banking industry. In fact, 5 banks today in the US hold 50% of checking accounts. And as part of one of the unintended consequences, at least I hope it was unintended, an extra 1 million Americans are outside the banking system because they can't afford it, because prices have gone up on checking accounts, the minimum balances have gone up, and a lot of people are simply outside the banking system now as a consequence.
As community banks are being destroyed for the benefit of the big banks.
Right.
And we also saw this in the bailout packages after the crisis, didn't we?
It was exactly the same type of phenomenon. There was an additional layer of arbitrariness, who was going to get a bailout and who wasn't, which created a climate of uncertainty. And there's significant evidence that the market would actually have taken care of things in the forms of other banks or other financial institutions bailing out the troubled ones. But because they expected a federal bailout, they didn't do that.
So what would you say to, let's say, the Occupy Wall Street movement that came about after this? Because they were coming and they were saying kind of two things that are not quite, some that's in line with you, some that's not. They were saying, this is injustice that's going on right now. And they said, it's capitalism failing.
That's the great irony of it all. The Occupy Wall Street movement and a lot of people who are against capitalism have identified a lot of the problems, but they're not problems with capitalism. They're problems with cronyism, and they're problems with interventionism. And what's being put up as a solution is more cronyism and more intervention. And what we're doing in this book is calling for more capitalism, more free exchange, freeing the markets, freeing the people to create wealth for themselves, as opposed to having these distortionary effects.
So in our last couple of minutes here, then, maybe The Justice of Capitalism is the title. And it's the Occupy Wall Street movement, and for that matter, democratic socialists in the United States now, who would talk about what they wanted was justice and what they see as the injustice of capitalism. Relate what you've been saying to how you see justice and capitalism together.
Well, capitalism is just, I think, for 2 reasons. First, as a principle, capitalism is free exchange. That's not what we see in the government sphere, where people are forced to do things. Capitalism is also just because it creates the greatest wealth, it lifts the most people out of poverty, and it gives people the most opportunity to flourish and live full lives. And what we need now to address the existing problems in the U.S., which we certainly don't deny in this book, there are problems with education, there are problems with poverty, problems with the environment. We need more capitalism, not less capitalism, because markets do a much better job. And then where markets fail, civil society can come in and help people. This is a longer story for the book about how civil society and charities have done a much better job than government.
Well, that's actually a good point. Maybe just take a moment on this. Of a lot of people will contrast it, that we have either the government or the market, and if the market can't handle it, it must be the government. Say something about this third alternative.
So that's a false dichotomy. We all live in 3 worlds. Every day. We live in the world of markets, we live in the world of government, and we live in the world of civil society. Most of us would balk at charging a friend $50 for a drive to the airport. It's the kind of stuff we do in exchange in families and friendship all the time. And what we saw in the US, for example, is that prior to Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, poverty was already falling, mostly because of markets after the New Deal era, and markets were being reliberated after the 1940s and after World War II. But also prior to that, and there's ample evidence of this in research, civil society, private hospitals, private charities were doing a fantastic job with local knowledge, as opposed to massive and inefficient government bureaucracies trying to attack poverty.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Well, we ranged kind of far and wide on today's show, but I think if there's a kind of consistent theme in the things that we talked about, it's that there are problems in the world and markets don't perfectly solve them instantly, but that often problems come about as the unintended byproducts of previous interventions into the marketplace by government. And that in the long run, while capitalism is not perfect at solving problems right now, the innovative process that creates wealth over time tends to maybe be the best way of addressing a lot of the problems that we're all concerned with. See you next time.